Hello everyone, welcome to David Arthur Agenda Truth. Today I'm going to be talking about the National Toxicology Programme. I'll read the summary from the Physicians for Safe Technology. The National Toxicology Programme, NTP, chronic carcinogenicity studies of cell phone radiofrequency radiation are the most comprehensive, carefully done research performed to date on the long-term effects of radiofrequency radiation from wireless devices such as cell phones. This 10-year, $25 million study by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences was completed and peer-reviewed March the 26th to 28th in 2018 in North Carolina. The animal research looked at long-term non-thermal exposure to radiofrequency cell phone radiation. The series of studies demonstrated positive findings, which are adverse effects, as follows. A statistically significant increase in tumours of the heart, schwannomas, brain, malignant gliomas, and adrenal gland, pheochromocytomas. Increase in other organ tumours compared to controls, not statistically significant but noteworthy, for pancreas, prostate, pituitary, liver and lung. DNA damage in rodents. Cardiomyopathy similar to aging. Adverse perinatal effects in some groups. Many organ systems were involved. There were increases in tumours in several other organs, including pituitary gland, thyroid, pancreas, skin and liver compared to controls. In some groups, no tumours were seen in the sham control animals. Malignant schwannomas of the heart, glial cell hyperplasia of the brain, malignant gliomas of the brain, hepatocellular adenomas or carcinomas in male rats. And in others, the sham controls had lower incidences of cancer than historical controls. Although increases in tumour development in other organs were not always statistically significant, for the pancreas there was a significantly increased incidence of adenoma or carcinoma combined in pancreatic islets in the lowest exposure group, which was 1.5 watts per kilo SAR GSM in male rats. Current SAR limit, SAR is the specific absorption rate, the current SAR limit is 1.6 watts per kilo for cell phone exposure. There were also significantly increased incidences of benign, malignant or complex pheochromocytoma combined in the adrenal medulla of the 1.5 and 3 watts per kilogram GSM male rats and 1.5 watts per kilogram CDMA in female rats. The full report is here, and there's the link for you. Evaluation of the genotoxicity of cell phone radiofrequency radiation in male and female rats and mice following subchronic exposure, and there's another link for you there. So there's two big papers. So that's the summary. I'm going to read the research overview actually from the National Toxicology Programme website. So some background information. Cell phones are currently used by 95% of American adults. The US Food and Drug Administration, FDA, nominated radiofrequency radiation used by cell phones for an NTP study because of widespread public use of cell phones and limited knowledge about potential health effects from long-term exposure. The NTP studies and findings. NTP conducted 2-year toxicology studies in rats and mice to help clarify potential health hazards, including cancer risk, from exposure to radiofrequency radiation like that used in 2G and 3G cell phones, which operate within a range of frequencies from about 700 to 2700 MHz. These were published as technical reports in November 2018. So what did the studies find? The NTP studies found that high exposure to RFR 900 MHz used by cell phones was associated with clear evidence of tumours in the hearts of male rats. The tumours were malignant schwannomas. Some evidence of tumours in the brains of male rats. The tumours were malignant gliomas. Some evidence of tumours in the adrenal glands of male rats. The tumours were benign, malignant, or complex combined pheochromocytoma. It was unclear if tumours observed in the studies were associated with exposure to RFR in female rats 900 MHz and male and female mice 1900 MHz. The results were based on NTP's 4 categories of evidence that a substance may cause cancer, clear evidence being the highest, some evidence, equivocal evidence, and no evidence being the lowest. As a follow-up, NTP published an article in October 2019 that evaluated DNA damage in 3 regions of the brain, the liver, and in blood cells in rats and mice that were removed at an earlier time point from the ongoing 2-year toxicology study. DNA damage, if not repaired, can potentially lead to tumours. This work was also included in NTP's published technical reports, but this study includes analysis of the data in the supporting information not included in the technical reports. NTP scientists found that RFR exposure was associated with an increase in DNA damage. Specifically, they found radiofrequency radiation exposure was linked with significant increases in DNA damage in the frontal cortex of the brain in male mice, the blood cells of female mice, and the hippocampus of male rats. Hippocampus. There are many factors that influence whether damaged DNA will lead to tumours. NTP plans to conduct additional studies to learn more about how RFR might cause DNA damage. Please see the frequently asked questions below for more information about the specific studies and NTP's cell phone RFR program. What are the NTP's future plans for studying cell phone RFR and 5G wireless technology? 5G is the emergent technology that will eventually overtake the existing 2G, 3G and 4G technology. In the meantime, people will continue to be exposed to RFR in the 700 to 2700 MHz range. As the 5G network is implemented, some of the signals used by the 5G network will use the same lower frequencies used by the older technology previously studied by NTP, but the 5G network will also use higher frequencies up to 60,000 MHz, thereby exposing wireless users to a much broader spectrum of frequencies. The higher frequencies, known as millimeter waves, can rapidly transmit enormous amounts of data with increased network capacity compared with current technologies. Millimeter waves do not travel as far and do not penetrate the body as deeply as do the wavelengths from the lower frequencies. Millimeter waves are likely to penetrate no deeper than the skin, whereas the lower frequencies have been shown to penetrate at least 3 to 4 inches into the human body. NTP is currently evaluating the existing literature on the higher frequencies intended for use in the 5G network and is working to better understand the biological basis for the cancer findings reported in earlier studies on RFR with 2G and 3G technologies. Additionally, work is ongoing to develop smaller RFR exposure chambers for additional short-term studies that will take weeks and months to complete rather than years. The exposure system is also being designed to have the capability to conduct studies with various radiofrequency radiation frequencies and modulations to keep up with the changing technologies in the telecommunications industry. NTP also aims to repeat studies in the smaller RFR exposure chambers and to identify biomarkers of damage from RFR exposure. The biomarkers would be measurable physical changes, such as molecular changes that can be seen in shorter amounts of time than it takes to develop cancer, and that might be predictive of the disease. If scientists can better understand biological changes in animals, they will know more about what to look for in humans. Additional studies could also identify whether the behavior of animals is affected by RFR exposure. So I put here frequently asked questions. So this might be very useful to look at actually. How do the cancer findings in male rats translate to what might be seen in people? Very common question, that one. NTP concludes that the findings from these studies show a link between cell phone radiation exposure and heart tumours. These findings were also supported by the precancerous changes called cardiomyopathy in heart tissue. The type of brain cancer observed is similar to a type of brain tumour associated with heavy cell phone use in some human studies. Still, the effects observed were relatively rare. Heart cancer was observed in approximately 2% of rats that were exposed at a lower level of RFR. Heart cancer was seen in 5 to 6% of rats exposed to a high power level, 4 times higher than the maximum human exposure. The next question. Does the fact that the animals were exposed to radiation all over their bodies, unlike humans who expose only certain body parts to cell phones, and for longer periods of time than humans generally use their phone, make it difficult or impossible to extrapolate these results for human health? NTP studies were conducted with whole-body exposures to evaluate the potential hazard to exposure across the entire body and not just particular regions. This allowed study scientists to identify particular organs that may be more at risk to the potential effects of radiofrequency radiation, as was the case in the hearts of male rats. When extrapolating from animal studies to human risk assessment for the effects of RFR, many complicating factors make the evaluation of exposure challenging, including the various ways people use their cell phones during normal usage conditions, such as via Bluetooth or speakerphone, or by putting the device directly next to their ear. It also includes variation in individual exposure due to disparities in signal strength depending on location. When extrapolating from highly controlled studies in laboratory animals to the less ordered exposure scenario that occurs in humans, many factors need to be addressed, and these findings should not be directly extrapolated to human cell phone usage. Not directly, but we can still learn from it. Why is it so difficult to understand the effect of these radiation-emitting devices on human health? Studying RFR is complicated. In addition to the toxicologists, statisticians, geneticists, pathologists and animal care staff, NTP scientists worked with electrical engineers and experts in RFR to design and build the exposure systems and monitor the exposure used in these studies. The goal was to identify what health effects could potentially be seen in humans. These studies will hopefully help other scientists have some idea about what to watch for in humans as our RFR exposures change over time. This is why NTP conducts toxicology studies to give other researchers a starting point. Why don't we have a consensus on the health effects of RFR exposure in the scientific community? Laboratories worldwide have conducted many studies on the safety of radiofrequency radiation. The varied approaches to study the health effects of RFR exposure make it difficult to integrate the data from these studies into a conclusive answer on RFR safety. Studying RFR can be more complicated than studies on drug or environmental chemical safety. Scientists need to consider both study design and how technical approaches and equipment were validated. They also need to factor in if experimental animals were reliably exposed to constant amounts of RFR and under stress-free conditions. And I would like to add, I think it was the Toxicology letter that I read out recently, that we need to, this is very isolated in pristine conditions without any other stresses, whereas us human beings in our daily lives, we always have many different biotoxins around us, whether from the food we eat, the air we breathe, the mold around, fungus, bacteria, viruses, all those kind of things. So we're exposed to a myriad of different toxic stimuli all the time. So the problem with these laboratory studies is they usually have just the radio frequency and then seeing what that will do. Whereas in reality, in a human exposure, I do agree that more real life experiments should be done, especially with exposure to different towers, different devices around the room, and that's going to be easier to extrapolate to conclusive advice, I'd say. Here's another question. If mobile phone caused certain cancers, shouldn't we expect to see an increase in the incidence of certain cancer types? There are many types of cancer with many contributing factors. Linking a certain cancer type to mobile phone use requires comparing specific types of cancers in groups of people who differ in their exposures to RFR. In studies conducted to date, scientists have not seen measurable increases in overall human cancers in organs that are highly exposed to RFR during typical mobile phone use. Scientists have not determined if RFR at any exposure level or duration does or does not increase certain cancers in people. There is uncertainty about whether some people are more susceptible to adverse effects from RFR exposures than other people. And I would say to that cancer is the breakdown of your body. It's like the final stages of the breakdown of your body. And when you're exposed to radio frequency, radiation, that's taken by your body, if it's not in a therapeutic effect, as a stressor, especially if it's pulsed and modulated. And a stressor just like eating sugar or some bad food or inhaling some bad air or ingesting some kind of chemical. Your body reacts to the radio frequency. So it depends on how healthy your body is, as that's why you see some people are more susceptible than others to radio frequency exposures. That's what I would say. If someone's health is already compromised, then they may become electrically sensitive, and we're seeing that more and more. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity, it's called EHS, and that's on the rise, definitely. Here's the next question. What issue that researchers are studying is most worrisome in terms of public health? Most concern has focused historically on the potential health effect of cell phone RFR exposure on the brain in humans. This concern was based on the fact that people used their cell phones in close proximity to their heads. Over the years, however, as the devices have become more capable, with greater connectivity at increased speed, the way consumers use their devices has been evolving. Cell phones are no longer only used to make and receive calls, which means that the devices may be held at locations other than against the head. Right, it does go around this answer a bit, but yeah, a lot of people still using phone on their head. And I know that John Kitson, his mother died, and she always used a cordless phone, and she had a brain tumour on the side that she held the phone. And there are lots of people that has happened to, where they develop a tumour on the side of the brain, exactly where they hold the phone. So I would say that's quite worrisome. Sometimes you need to look at people around you and see the patterns there, what's going on, as well as listen to the scientists. The next question: is there a way to convert the amount of exposure experienced by the male rats that develop tumours to what humans might be exposed to? Extrapolation of NTP findings to humans is not straightforward, and the studies were not designed with that as a primary purpose. Rather, the purpose was to test whether exposures to RFR could cause biological effects at levels of exposure that did not significantly raise the body temperature of the animals. Current RFR human exposure limits by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, for cell phone use mandate that the temperature of tissue next to where the phone is held does not increase by more than 1 degree Celsius. Why did NTP see more cancer in male rats than in female rats? NTP scientists aren't sure why male rats appear to be at greater risk for developing tumours compared with female rats. Good question, simple answer. Don't know. If the studies on DNA damage were included in the technical reports, why did NTP publish a standalone study on these findings? The standalone study provides more information on how the DNA damage data were analysed in the supporting information section. The conclusions of the standalone study are the same as the conclusions in the technical reports. How does NTP study the amount of DNA damage in a cell, and what are the implications of the results of this kind of experiment? To study DNA damage, NTP used a test called a COMET assay, also known as a single-cell gel electrophoresis assay. This experiment provides a general indication of DNA damage in a cell. Cells have many enzymes that repair DNA, so the amount of DNA damage that is observed at one time is dependent on how much damage was caused initially and how quickly and effectively the cell can repair the damage. This is what I was saying earlier. If the body's in a better state, it is better able to deal with the stress of the EMFs and can repair more quickly. Hypothetically, a cell could repair all of the damage, or it could experience so much damage that it dies. In both of these scenarios, the DNA damage is eliminated. However, if the DNA damage is not repaired, or if it is repaired but incorrectly, then when that cell divides, the daughter cells may have those damaged areas in their DNA that could potentially lead to tumours. NTP did not do a time course study, so they don't know if the cells were able to repair all of the damage and therefore would have been at lower risk of potentially becoming a cancer cell. NTP scientists did learn that RFR exposure to DNA damage under the conditions of the study, but they do not know the mechanism by which RFR caused DNA damage. Did NTP find any health benefits of exposure to cell phone RFR? Interestingly, exposure to RFR extended the lifespan of male rats. Wow. Although NTP scientists are not yet sure why. They did notice that exposure to cell phone RFR appeared to lessen chronic kidney disease in aging male rats, which is often the animal's cause of natural death. So we're in a field of, they say everything is frequency, everything is vibration. I think even Tesla said, understand frequency and vibration and you'll understand the universe. And that's so true, really. It'd be good to study the therapeutic effects of RFR and how we can use that, and know which ones are dangerous and which ones to avoid. And that's what the whole journey is about here, to try and uncover the truth bit by bit. Next question. How do the animal exposures in this study relate to human exposures from modern cell phones? A major difference is that, in the studies, the animals were exposed over their whole bodies, in contrast to human exposure, which is typically from a single point of exposure at a more localized area. Most previous studies had focused on exposure to the brain, but NTP researchers wanted to make sure they were considering effects to the whole body, especially since people don't hold their phones next to their head much of the time. Can the findings be directly extrapolated to humans? You did ask that earlier. There are two ways to look at this. Do they directly apply? No. There were differences between how the animals were exposed to RFR in the studies and the exposure experienced by someone who uses a cell phone. On the other hand, some of the tumours in exposed animals have also been seen in humans, so they may have relevance. Have NTP scientists changed their cell phone use or what they recommend to their families? That's a good question. NTP scientists have become more aware of their usage and follow the FDA's tips for reducing exposure to cell phone RFR. I'll just open that in a new tab. Reduce the amount of time spent using your cell phone, remove the cause, and use the speaker mode or headset to place more distance between your head and the cell phone. And I did a much more comprehensive advice video. I think it's the third one that I did. It's called Takeaways and Solutions of the IEEE paper. I give you much more advice than this. Okay, so on to the study methods. How much did the study cost? Why did it take so long? The study cost $30 million and took about 10 years, which was different to what I read earlier. So, but this is straight from the NTP site, so I will take that, $30 million and 10 years. It took a significant amount of time because NTP first evaluated existing studies of the topic and then decided to design a new system for exposing rats and mice to cell phone RFR. This new system improved on what was being used at the time. NTP scientists conducted preliminary studies testing body temperature increases or overtoxicity before finally getting to the 2-year toxicity studies in rats and mice. Okay, so it's 2 years at the end. Then they evaluated 40 tissues from nearly 3,000 animals for cancer and other tissue changes, followed by statistical analysis and writing the reports. Can NTP provide more information on how these studies were conducted? The studies were conducted in 3 phases. First, because radiofrequency radiation generates heat when absorbed by the body, NTP did pilot studies to determine exposure levels that did not exceed the ability of the animals to maintain normal body temperatures. Next, the scientists did short duration studies to determine exposure levels that did not affect the normal growth and development of rats and mice. And finally, they performed studies in which pregnant rats and their offspring and young adult mice were exposed to radiofrequency radiation for the better part of their natural lifetime, or approximately 2 years. Wow. Where were the studies conducted? NTP conducted the study at the Illinois Institute of Technology and Research Institute in Chicago. What are the details of the reverberation chambers used in the study? The reverberation chambers used to expose rats and mice to cell phone RFR were conceptualized by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, and further designed and tested by NIST and the Foundation for Research on Information Technologies in Society, ITIS, in Zurich, Switzerland. The reverberation chamber system used allowed lengthy daily exposures to unrestrained rodents, lessening the chance for heating and stress as in restrained animal exposure systems used by others. What were the study's strengths? A major strength of the study is that NTP scientists had better control of the RFR exposures. That's one of the reasons they spent so much time on the exposure system, to make sure they were testing what they wanted to test. What are some of the study's limitations? This study had a lot fewer limitations than much of the prior research conducted on this topic. The main limitation was the unexpected finding of longer lifespans among the exposed male rats, but this may be explained by an observed concurrent decrease in chronic kidney problems that are often the rats' cause of death. Exactly how much radiation were the animals exposed to, and over what period of time? In NTP's chronic studies, the rats were exposed to between 1.5 and 6 watts per kilo of body weight for 2 years. In the mouse studies, animals were exposed to between 2.5 and 10 watts per kilo for 2 years. These were whole body exposures, so the animals were exposed evenly across their entire bodies. Wow. What is the difference between CDMA and GSM modulations? This is a good question for you all. Code Division Multiple Access is CDMA, and Global System for Mobile Communications, GSM, are two common ways of transmitting cell phone signals in the United States and Europe. There are substantial differences in signal structure that may result in different exposures to cell phone RFR, so NTP wanted to expose the animals to both modulations. CDMA sends data in small bits over a number of the discrete frequencies available for use at any time in the specified range, a form of transmission known as direct sequence spread spectrum. CDMA signal modulation is based on code division separation of mobile stations as well as base stations. GSM, which was developed to establish a digital standard throughout Europe, allows the transmission of basic data services such as short message service, SMS, texts, but not large packets of data such as internet access and streaming video. Okay. Were the pathology reviews blinded? How was blinding handled? Yes. The pathology evaluation of the RFR rat and mouse studies was performed according to standard practices in toxicologic pathology. This involved a 3-step review process that included 1. Unblinded reads by the initial study pathologist, 2. A second quality assurance pathology review, then 3. A blinded evaluation of target lesions by a group of NTP and outside expert pathologists. All pathology slides from NTP studies are housed in the NTP archives and are available for review by anyone interested. How does NTP classify evidence of carcinogenicity? The 4 classifications of evidence of carcinogenicity are: clear evidence, the highest level, some evidence, equivocal evidence, and no evidence, the lowest level. If there is insufficient evidence to draw conclusions, NTP uses the term inadequate study. Final question in this section. Could the results be due to thermal changes from RFR or the result of stress of the animals? It's unlikely. The NTP studies were performed at power levels that limited heating to less than 1 degree Celsius. Note, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and the US Food and Drug Administration, FDA, currently allow 1 degree Celsius local tissue heating for cell phones operating at maximal power, as would occur when in an elevator or when far away from a base station. That's interesting to know. So you will get tissue heating from cell phones operating at maximum power when you're in an elevator. I've done that before. And when you're far away from a base station, I've done that before. So you want to have good signal and don't use your phone in a lift. Alright? Different generations of wireless technology and future plans. This study was conducted using radiation from 2G and 3G devices. It's not even considering 4G. Are the levels the same with 4G? Do NTP scientists have any idea if the rollout of 5G will expose us to different types of radiation or radiation in higher volume? Current wireless communication networks like 4G still use 2G and 3G technologies for voice calls and texting. 4G, 4G LTE and 5G networks were developed to support increased data needs like streaming video or instantly downloading email with attachments. These newer technologies use different methods of cell phone signal modulation than NTP used in the study. It is difficult to compare 5G to the current and previous generations of wireless networks. In general, NTP scientists are still trying to understand the impact of exposure to RFR on biological tissues, regardless of G. But to complicate matters more, aspects of the 5G network will use a vastly different set of frequencies, up to more than 6,000 MHz, than those currently in use with 2G, 3G and 4G LTE, which is 700 to 2,700 MHz networks. It is well known that absorption of RFR at these higher frequencies differs significantly from absorption at the lower frequencies, in that the shorter wavelengths of the high frequencies cannot penetrate nearly as deep into the body. Therefore, much of the absorption at the higher frequencies occurs in the skin and would not penetrate deep enough to reach the heart, brain and adrenal gland, which develop tumours in NTP studies at 900 MHz. Additionally, since the higher frequency signals in the 5G network have shorter reaching distances and are unable to penetrate physical barriers, substantially more transmitters and antennae are required to provide coverage to consumers. Therefore, the proximity of humans to the antenna may increase, which could potentially lead to higher exposures. However, because the antennas will be widely dispersed, the power levels of RFR for 5G may be lower than those currently used for 2G, 3G and 4G. Well, they do plan to put it on every single street light and have indoor relay nodes, so that's not true at all, is it? At this point, it is unclear exactly whether or to what degree human exposure to RFR will change. What is known regarding 5G, however, is that while continuing to be exposed to the current frequencies, wireless consumers will be exposed to the higher frequencies as well. If you want more info, it's not really giving you anything on the 5G front or the 4G front. It is out of its scope. It is looking at 2G, 3G. So just take what it's saying about 5G, just take it in, but if you want to know much more up-to-date detail, then go to my first, second, and third video even, and the toxicology letter, and that's talking about 5G in much more detail and much more relevance. How do the exposures relate to Wi-Fi? NTP did not study the frequencies of modulations used for Wi-Fi. Are there any additional studies planned by NTP? NTP is collaborating with the National Institute of Standards and Technology on additional short-term exposure studies in smaller cell phone RFR exposure chambers. These studies will focus on further clarifying what NTP learned in the long-term studies and investigating the possibility of DNA damage in exposed tissues. Additionally, the new chambers have increased flexibility with respect to exposure scenarios and increased signal generating capabilities, which allow NTP to test the different modulations and frequencies used in 3G and 4G LTE networks. NTP scientists are also looking at efficient ways to address some of the issues that are emerging regarding RFR exposures and 5G. They hope to begin the new RFR studies in 2020. I would encourage them to get on the ball with that, as I'm even reading things about 6G and 7G, and it seems like they're always playing catch-up. If they're just doing 3G and 4G LTE networks, and if it's going to be on mice and rats again, and then you can't extrapolate it to humans, it's just a lot of work for not very much help. How else will the new chambers be used? After verifying that the new smaller chambers are working properly, NTP scientists want to see the effect that they saw on DNA damage in their studies is replicable in these follow-up experiments. This will give scientists more confidence in the result of the initial studies, as reproducibility is an important concept in any scientific study, especially one as complex as studying cell phone RFR. Now there's just 4 last questions here, and then we'll get on to the summary. Does NTP have any say in the regulatory decision of cell phones? Regulatory agencies such as the US Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Communications Commission, 2 people not to be trusted, by the way, are responsible for evaluating the potential risk associated with exposure to RFR from wireless devices and the compliance of the devices to those standards, respectively. These agencies evaluate pertinent data in laboratory animals and the results from any studies that may be available in humans to identify hazards and conduct risk assessments that establish guidelines for safe exposures in humans. Questions regarding the adequacy of current exposure guidelines, regulatory limits, and potential risk should be directed to those agencies. What is the process for the final review by external experts? A panel of scientific experts from outside of NTP conducted a thorough scientific review of the NTP conclusions during a meeting at NIEHS on March the 26th, 2018. The meeting was open to the public and webcasted, and videos of the meeting are available on the NTP page at ntp.niehs.nih.gov. Why did NTP adopt the peer review recommendations rather than sticking with its original draft conclusions? In the end, the peer review recommendations represented the consensus from the 3-day peer review meeting in March 2018. These recommendations largely overlapped with conclusions in the draft NTP report, but the panel recommended stronger levels of evidence for several tumours. Interesting. NTP supports this consensus and appreciates the thoughtful input from all involved. A range of factors are considering when interpreting scientific evidence and drawing conclusions. NTP's meeting in March gave NTP scientists a chance to examine and debate these factors in detail for the radiofrequency radiation studies. So I can see that they dampened their findings a little bit. Last question. Why were the draft reports released to the public prior to peer review? This has been part of NTP's transparent review process for its entire 40-year history. It gives NTP's many stakeholders a chance to weigh in before reports are final. The public comments were then collected and provided to the panel of expert reviewers for their consideration per the usual protocol. So I really like that transparency, allowing us to see both what was released prior to the peer review. Okay, so that's that. That page I opened of the FDA recommendations failed to open, so we'll ignore that. I'm just going to save these. I'm just going to bookmark these 4 tabs in a folder, considering it's all NTP. Okay, so this is a very short page. I'm just going to read it. High exposure to radiofrequency radiation associated with cancer in male rats. This was released Thursday, November 1st, 2018. National Toxicology Programme releases final reports on rat and mouse studies of RFR radiation used in 2G and 3G. The NTP levels concluded there is clear evidence that male rats exposed to high levels of radiofrequency that used in 2G and 3G develop cancerous heart tumours, according to final reports released today. There was also some evidence of tumours in the brain and adrenal gland exposed male rats, female rats, and male and female mice. The evidence was equivocal as to whether cancers observed were exposed with exposure to RFR. The final reports represent the consensus of NTP and panel of external scientific experts who reviewed the studies in March after draft reports were issued in February. And I just clicked on the draft reports, which I might be able to get there. So that's said everything we've said already. So I'll get rid of those. Now this is what they released. It's kind of it's got some diagrams, it's got some colour, it's nice to look at. So this was released by the NTP after the peer review of the NTP study. So here we go. Cell phone radio frequency radiation studies. This is what NTP is saying. Cell phones are used by 95% American adults. Given the large number of users, any harmful effects associated with cell phone use could be a significant public health concern. Cell phones use radiofrequency radiation to transmit signals. The US Food and Drug Administration nominated RFR for study by the National Toxicology Programme. Due to widespread human exposure and limited information about the potential health effects of long-term cell phone use. What did NTP study? NTP conducted toxicology studies in rats and mice to help clarify potential health hazards, including cancer risk from exposure to RFR used in 2G and 3G cell phones. 2G and 3G networks were standard when the studies were designed and are still used for phone calls and texting. The $30 million NTP studies took more than 10 years to complete and are the most comprehensive assessment to date of health effects in animals exposed to RFR. This is why I'm reading it. The results will help guide other studies of newer technologies. What did the studies find? NTP studies found that exposure to high levels of RFR, like that used in 2G and 3G cell phones, was associated with clear evidence of tumours in the hearts of male rats. The tumours were malignant schwannomas. Some evidence of tumours in the brains of male rats. The tumours were malignant gliomas. Some evidence of tumours in the adrenal glands of male rats. The tumours were pheochromocytomas. For female rats and male and female mice, it was unclear, also known as equivocal, whether cancers observed in the studies were associated with exposure to RFR. The conclusions were based on NTP's 4 categories of evidence that a substance may cause cancer: clear evidence, some evidence, equivocal evidence, and no evidence. And it's got 2 very small suggestions here. If you are concerned about potential health risks from RFR, the FDA suggests the following tips. Use speaker mode or a headset to place more distance between you and your head and your cell phone. Reduce the amount of time spent using your cell phone. Well, that wasn't hard, was it? Do the rat and mouse findings apply to humans? The findings in animals cannot be directly applied to humans for 2 key reasons. The exposure levels and durations were greater than what people may receive from cell phones. The rats and mice received RFR across the whole bodies, which is different from the more localized exposures humans may receive, like from a cell phone in their pocket or next to their head. However, the studies question the long-held assumption that radiofrequency is of no concern as long as the energy level is low and does not significantly heat the tissues. It's kind of a little bit annoying that you would spend $30 million and take 10 years to do it when you can't extrapolate directly the results to humans. I mean, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of time, and all that you come out with is just, yeah, it's probably linked, but we can't directly, yeah. It's like, come on, can we be a bit more efficient, please? But then we think, who actually enabled the study, you know? And that was FDA, can't be trusted, and FCC, definitely can't be trusted. A way to kick the can down the road, you could think of it like that. Did NTP find health effects other than cancer? NTP found lower body weights among newborn rats and their mothers, especially when exposed to high levels of RFR during pregnancy and lactation, yet these animals grew to normal size. They also found that RFR exposure was associated with an increase in DNA damage. I mean, we know this now. DNA damage is going to happen if you're exposed to radiofrequency radiation. DNA damage, if not repaired, can potentially lead to tumours. Specifically, they found RFR exposure was linked with significant increases in DNA damage in the frontal cortex of the brain in male mice, the blood cells of female mice, and the hippocampus of male rats. What factors contributed to the NTP conclusions? In addition to seeing tumours in the male rats with higher exposures to RFR, NTP scientists also observed other changes in the hearts of exposed male and female rats that support their conclusions. The evidence for tumours in the brain and adrenal glands was not as strong as what NTP scientists saw in the heart. However, the type of brain cancer observed is similar to a type of brain tumour linked to heavy cell phone use in some human studies. It's got a reference there. Why did NTP expose the animals' whole bodies to RFR? Although many previous studies focused on exposure to the brain, NTP scientists wanted to make sure that they were considering health effects to the whole body, especially since many people do not hold their phones next to their head much of the time. It's got a lovely little diagram here. Electromagnetic spectrum, non-ionising and ionising. I mean, we know all this already. Low frequency, high frequency is ionising. So in the low frequency area you have power lines, radio and TV waves, cell phones, microwaves, infrared devices, and then you start getting into the high frequencies, which is visible light, ultraviolet radiation, X-rays, and radioactive waste. Wow. So we're talking about the first half of that, basically. But there is clear evidence in many other papers that non-ionising, non-thermal EMF causes adverse health effects. What is the difference between electric and magnetic fields and RFR? RFR is a subcategory of electric and magnetic fields, EMF, which are the invisible waves of force that surround any electrical device. The different types of EMF are distinguished by their frequencies. RFR is a form of low frequency, non-ionising radiation that was thought to be relatively harmless, but we know it isn't. How were the studies conducted? Rats and mice were exposed to RFR in special chambers for up to 2 years, or most of their natural lives. NTP scientists looked for a range of cancers and non-cancer health effects. Exposure to RFR began in the womb for rats at 5 to 6 weeks old for mice. The RFR exposure was intermittent, 10 minutes on and 10 minutes off, totaling about 9 hours each day. The RFR levels range from 1.5 to 6 watts per kilo of body weight in rats and 2.5 to 10 watts per kilogram in mice. The chambers were shielded rooms with a transmitting antenna that radiated RFR fields plus rotating stirrers that generated a uniform field. Pilot studies established field strengths that did not raise animal body temperatures excessively. That means not more than 1 degree Celsius. The rats and mice were exposed to whole body RFR at frequencies of 900 and 1900 MHz, respectively, from 2 technologies: Code Division Multiple Access, CDMA, and Global System for Mobile Communications, GSM. NTP and RFR experts from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and the ITIS Foundation designed and built the chambers specifically for these studies. Here's a picture of the chambers at the IIT Research Institute in Chicago, Illinois, where the studies took place. So those are the chambers. What is the difference between CDMA and GSM? I mean, we talked about this before, but it's nice to get this more abbreviated version. CDMA and GSM are 2 common ways of transmitting cell phone signals in the US and Europe. There are substantial differences in signal structure that may result in different RFR exposures, so NTP wanted to expose the animals to both modulations. How do the NTP studies relate to 4G, 5G or Wi-Fi? In short, they don't. NTP studies of RFR used in 2G and 3G cell phones do not apply to 4G or 5G technologies. These newer technologies use different methods of signal modulation than NTP used in the studies. The NTP studies also did not investigate frequencies and modulations used for Wi-Fi, which again is different. Let's read this little phone thing. In March 2018, a panel of external scientific experts thoroughly reviewed the draft NTP technical reports at a public meeting. The final conclusions represent the consensus between NTP and the panel. What were the study's strengths? NTP was able to control exactly how much RFR the animals received, something that is not possible when studying human cell phone use. Yeah. Were there any surprise findings? NTP found longer lifespans among the exposed male rats. This may be explained by an observed decrease in chronic kidney problems that are often the cause of death in older rats. So rats usually die of kidney failure, and for some bizarre reason, the radiofrequency waves actually delayed that and increased their lifespan. What will NTP do with the results of the studies? NTP will provide these studies to the FDA and the Federal Communications System Commission. Great. The agencies will review the information as they continue to monitor new research on the potential health effects of RFR. Final reports and data tables are available on the NTP website, and there's the website there. I won't read that out. Okay, final page on this. What are NTP's future plans for studying cell phone RFR and 5G wireless technology? 5G is the emergent technology that will eventually overtake the existing technology. In the meantime, people will continue to be exposed to RFR in the 700 to 2700 MHz range. And I'll just jump in there. That is because 2G, 1G, 2G, 3G is embedded within 4G, 5G. As the 5G network is implemented, some of the signals used by the 5G network will use the same low frequencies used by the older technology, what I just said. But the 5G network will also use higher frequencies, up to 60,000 megahertz. Well, they say it will go much higher, thereby exposing people to a much broader spectrum of frequencies. The plan is actually up to 300 gigahertz, by the way. Eventually. The higher frequencies, known as millimeter waves, can rapidly transmit enormous amounts of data with increased network capacity compared with current technologies. Millimeter waves do not travel as far and do not penetrate the body as deeply as do the wavelengths from the lower frequencies. They keep saying that, but if there are many factors at play, such as power, could that be changed? That's a question I'm asking myself. Millimeters waves are likely to penetrate no deeper than the skin. It just says likely, whereas the lower frequencies have been shown to penetrate at least 3 to 4 inches into the body. So the lower you are on the spectrum, it will pass straight through your body, which isn't good. And then as you get higher up the spectrum, there's kind of 3 to 4 inch into your body, and they're saying that as you go even higher, the absorption will be less. But what about if you change the modulation or the power, just the type of wave? Is that going to make a difference? My guess is probably yes. But you can't just say all high frequencies are not going to enter the body, because there are many other factors. NTP is currently evaluating the existing literature on the high frequencies intended for use in the 5G network, and is working to better understand the biological basis for the cancer findings reported in earlier studies on RFR with 2G and 3G technologies. Additionally, work is ongoing to develop smaller RF exposure chambers for additional short-term studies that will take weeks and months to complete rather than years. The exposure system is also being designed to have the capability to conduct studies with various RFR frequencies and modulations to keep up with the changing technologies in the telecommunications industry. So for more information on what federal agencies are doing to determine whether RFR used in cell phones may affect human health, visit the following websites: National Toxicology Program, the National Cancer Institute, the US Food and Drug Administration, and the Federal Communications Commission. Now, I know for a fact I do not trust the FDA, and I do not trust the FCC. Because they definitely have covered up critical information or stirred doubt over critical information for human health in the past, and they continue to do so. So there we have it. That was the kind of summary on the NTP study. I'll get the technical report here. Here's one of the technical reports. I'm not going to read through this now, but here's toxicology and carcinogenesis studies in Sprague-Dawley SD rats exposed to whole body radio frequency at 900 megahertz of modulations, GSM and CDMA. So the GSM and CDMA modulations, yeah. And this is very long. How long is it? It's like 380 pages. Oh, it says at the top 384 pages, and there's 2 of these. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Now you know what the NTP study is all about, and we've explained it in detail, so that when people mention it to you, the NTP study, you know exactly what's going on. And if someone hasn't heard about it, then just vice versa, you can explain to them exactly what it was. And to get this thing that I read through, you can go to niehs.nih.gov, and I'm going to put all these links below. That's it from me. I'll see you next time.